Welcome everyone who's joined us for this panel. Thank you for taking the time to come and listen to our wonderful panelists today. My name is Ameya Naik. I'm a senior manager at eGovernment's Foundation on the policy initiatives team. I'm going to be just doing a few admin announcements, and then we'll hand it over to Gautham, who will be our moderator today. We will be doing this in roughly 3 waves. So we'll have one set of remarks from the panelists that will go for about half an hour. Then we'll have another that will go for another 20 minutes or so. Then we'll open up for Q&A. You can use the Q&A tab to enter your questions. You can also upvote questions over there. So when Gautham is going through and he picks them out to be answered, if he sees any that have a bunch of votes, he'll know that lots of people want to hear the answers to those ones. So please feel free to enter your questions and upvote questions as we go through the panel. I think that's everything I need to cover. So with that, over to Gautham. And as each speaker starts, I will also put up their bio and leave that in chat, so we don't have to spend too much time on introductions. Gautham.
Yeah, pardon me for a sec, but my entire screen has decided to go a little wonky. But this is the joy of an online webinar. So I can't see my screen, but I'm still going to get started. So thank you all for joining us today, and thanks to the panelists for coming and joining us for this conversation. I would like to say thank you also to the Palantir Networks for the chance to participate in the global dialogue. When we were thinking about why we wanted to do this panel, we had a few thoughts in mind. So I'm just going to share those, and then I'll get out of the way so that you can all listen to the panelists and let them take the stage. But primarily, we are all here because we agree that cities are important, that they have the potential to be a force for growth, for inclusion, for democracy. We are also here because we believe there's a gap between the reality of cities and the promise of cities. And so Ameya will actually be putting up a slide on screen, which will be an interesting one. And if you look at this one, it's kind of, this is going to frame our entire conversation. So this slide captures the fundamental reality of cities. Cities are a physical, geographical unit, and we all know this. We can actually find our maps, we can zoom into our neighborhoods, we can identify our wards, we can identify our houses, and we know who our neighbors are, and there's a physicality to the space. But there is so much more to cities. Cities are systems of systems, and because of that, there are all these interactions between economics, society, culture, policy, regulation, and these complex systems actually lead to the growth of the city, and they also lead to a lot of questions about the direction in which they're evolving. So we're going to start with where are we and where do we want to get to? And I'm going to flip this comic to say, we are here today, and that's what the panelists will take us through. And then they will take us through where do we want to get to. So with that, I'm going to go to Jagan. And my first question to Jagan is this. Jagan, we often think about governance and we think about the responsibility of government. So for this wider audience, what does city government look like? And does it look any different in India than anywhere else? And what does city government in India do?
Thanks, Gautham. That's a big question. I think instead of often thinking about city governance, we should be thinking about it every day. It should preoccupy our daily lives a lot more than it currently does, and I'll explain why. What does city government look like right now? If you look at the metropolitan scale, it's a very different ball game than if you look at in small or medium towns. But on the whole, what we find as a characteristic is that it tends to be fragmented. It tends to have a lot of legacy systems and a lot of legacy cultures of working. And all of those have to be somehow brought together and given coherence and given leadership by the administrator. And the administrator could be a representative of a smaller group or council, but ultimately it tends to be an individual. The huge difference between the way we are managing our cities and the way that a large part of the world manages cities is the lack of a sort of a strong mayoral system. We don't have city mayors who are individuals, who are elected mayors, who are empowered to take all the decisions or to provide the leadership on all decision making that you would expect as a citizen. And this is why I made that somewhat flippant comment in the beginning that we should be thinking a lot more about this, because the future of our lives, so to speak, depend on it. So that's broadly sort of the big difference. India does have mayors, but the mayors in some states could be having, say, financial powers as small as 1,200 rupees. That's the kind of mayoral system that we have. It exists, but it ultimately boils down to a government officer who actually runs municipalities. Now, what's the issue here? I think the issue is that a city is ultimately, as you said, a city of system, a system of systems. And each system is a complex little world in itself. Take, for example, a water supply system and a transportation system. If you have to provide buses that carry people to work and back to their homes, and if you have to supply water to their homes, which must, of course, be clean and flow through their tap, these are two extremely complex sort of businesses, right? And for an administrator to bring all of this together is an extremely complex task. So what role does monitoring and evaluation play in all of this? Let's understand that monitoring and evaluation takes place on a real-time basis, on a daily basis in the life of a municipality. A city administrator is fundamentally questioned on a daily basis on what, quote unquote, can be called progress. And you can look at it metaphorically, you can look at it metaphysically. You've already given a philosophical twist to this whole session, but progress is what administrators are measured on. But that progress ultimately is based on a few key metrics. Say, for instance, how much money is being actually spent and getting out there into the world? Is it going into social programs, social protection? Is it being spent on building sidewalks? So very narrowly defined ideas about progress. And then we've got the whole world of donors and NGOs and others who keep bombarding this administrator with lots of new metrics. So of course there's the SDGs, and I don't question the value of them. There's various kinds of climate goals to also be questioned on. There's jobs, there's economic performance. There are a number of different monitoring and evaluation indicators that are, in a sense, thrown at the administrator. But fundamentally, we must understand that the administrator's key requirement is to satisfy his or her political bosses. Let's put it that way, right? So ultimately, that's the importance. And I'll quickly end my point, Gautham. Now, the thing is that if I have to essentially meet that very simple metric, what do I need to do? I need to be able to perform better, achieve progress better. So any monitoring and evaluation that helps me do that, in a sense, anything that helps me make decisions better, choose better, so that I'm more in the grip of, or rather I have a stronger grip on the outcomes that I achieve through the decisions I take, the more welcome that is to an administrator. Beyond that, in a large number of cases in my experience, the rest is all sort of, it's nice to have, but it's not necessary as a metric to my life as an administrator. So in terms of decision making, we need to kind of draw a very hard line between what we produce as measures of somebody's performance, which is motivated to achieve progress, and their ability to take decisions on the basis of those measures.
Thank you, Jagan.
Now, I'll just close with a final thought, which is that I believe that, and we can come back to this hopefully, I believe that the best way to help decision-making take place is to also help the administrator get a grip on the spatial and the systemic complexity of the city. And whatever systems we put in place for that are always going to be welcome. I'll pause there. Thanks, Gautham.
Thank you, Jagan. With that, I'm actually going to come to Pritika. And Pritika, I am going to invite you to take us through the major promise of a city that it's going to be an economic powerhouse. And we've heard these numbers often, right? 60% of our GDP will come from there, 67%, 70%. Cities are economic powerhouses, economic systems. In fact, city networks and peripheral areas, also how they interact, drives growth. So when we need to think about cities as economic units, what does your research tell us, and what are the aspects that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking of cities as economic units?
Thanks, Gautham. So yes, and I think this is, so let me just re-emphasize the point that you made, because I think that this is a point that actually gets lost in the conversation about cities, definitely in India and across a lot of the developing world, that fundamentally at their core, cities are economic units. And we don't think of it, those of us, and so another way to think of it is that cities are labor markets, right? So we move, or if we didn't move, then our parents or our grandparents moved to cities in search of opportunity, and firms locate in cities so that they can access talent pools, right? So I think what tends to happen is we focus a lot on the physical infrastructure and the built form of cities, and we forget the basic function that they provide. And, if you just take a sweep of history, you see this, across the centuries. I mean, every city, whether it was a trading port, or an education center, attracts people to it for the opportunities there. And I think this is something that we have to put at the center of our understanding of cities. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean when it comes to data? And specifically the point that Jagan made, which is what is the important data that an administrator needs to have, right? It's good to have all sorts of data, but what do you fundamentally need to know? What you fundamentally need to know is what is the productivity and what is the economic, potential and the GDP of your city. So, the best estimates we have, and there's a couple of estimates of this, 60 to 70% of India's GDP comes from cities. Now, we know to begin with that our definition of what is a city itself is flawed. We also know that all these estimates, they are best case estimates. IDFC Institute has been trying for 3 years to put together an estimate of city GDP, are very hard to come by because we don't collect the sort of data that allows us to make these estimates in the first place. If you even step back from something like city GDP, if you just wanted to know what is employment density, right? So for London, I can pull up employment density, which is in this particular neighborhood, how many jobs are there? What are the types of jobs? How many people come into this area every morning and leave every evening? That allows you to make decisions on transportation infrastructure. That allows you to make decisions on, housing, on office space, on taxes, on all sorts of things. But when we're missing those fundamental building blocks of the data in Indian cities, we're really shooting in the dark. But then to come to another point that Jagan raised is, which you also need the ability to act on the data that you have. I think that's a much deeper problem that we have to fix, which is nobody in our cities are actually tasked with delivering growth, because those two things are disconnected in our heads. It's nobody. So, New York City has the Economic Development Council, and New York City has reinvented itself over time, right? So meatpacking district was the meatpacking district. Today there's restaurants and art galleries, and every city, I mean, from from all over the world has reinvented itself over time. But for that, you need to understand what the economic base of the city is. So that's one. The second thing is, and I just want to build on what Jagan said towards the end about spatial data. That's the other really important piece of it, right? So not only do you need the data, but you need to know where the data is located. And I mean this in two ways. So one is just pure geospatial data. And I'll talk a little bit about what the value of that has been to our research. And the second is spatializing data that you have. So it's different from when you see a number in an Excel sheet and when you see where it is on a map. So one of the earliest projects that we did at IDFC Institute that was led by my colleagues, Komal and Vedahi, was essentially saying, how urban is India? right? And we know the official statistics tell us India is 26 or 31% urban, depending on which one you use. But if you use any alternate definition of urban that any country in the world uses, you find that India is somewhere between 50 to 67% urban. What really drove the point home was when we looked at satellite data, right? Because you can quibble about definitions, but when you look at satellite data and you see the sheer extent and spread of cities, is when you realize this is a reality we can't escape. And I think relying on geospatial data a lot more allows us to, to plug the gaps in available administrative data very quickly. The second piece is what happens when you then geolocate the data that you have. And so I'm just, to draw your attention to something else that we did. We did one of the first crime victimization surveys in India. And that essentially looked at the gap between the true incidence of crime as measured by a survey and what shows up in the crime statistics. What we didn't realize we did, so we conducted the survey in 4 cities around the country at the police zone level. And we were able to say, okay, here's what's actually happening in terms of crimes, and here's what's showing up in your crime statistics. What we didn't realize at the time that we created it is that we were giving the police a very powerful tool for decision support. So you're suddenly able to, the police commissioner becomes the CEO and is able to say, okay, if I look at a map of my city, here's where there's more underreporting, or here's where there's this sort of crime. And when I have to make decisions about allocation of scarce resources, it's much easier to make those decisions. So just in sum, I agree that we should not collect everything that we can for the sake of collecting it. We need to be really thoughtful about what we collect, why we're collecting it, and what outcomes they can help us drive. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Pritika. And with that comment about crime and safety, I actually want to come to Sarayu. Sarayu, thank you for co-hosting this panel with us. And my question to you today is going to start with where our conversation started, right? You said, you wrote that article that kind of caught all our attentions. Where are India's citizens in the National Urban Innovation Stack, right? And I'm going to flip that today. I would like to ask you, we've talked about city administration, city economic systems, but cities are about people, the citizens, the residents, the human beings. Who are they? What are they doing? What do they need from a city? Right. And can you break this up across the spectrum?
Right. That's a super complex question, and I hope it's something we keep circling back to in the course of this conversation. I hope very much that it is a broader part of the policy conversation as we go forward as well. So this is just the start. As Pritika was speaking, I was nodding along, mostly because I agreed, but also because what missing chunks of economic data mean is that chunks of citizens or groups of citizens, particularly marginalized identities, and very much these sort of missing pieces and tracks or circles around data sort of exclude those who are already vulnerable from imaginations of the city, from planning, and therefore the ability to respond to a range of concerns. So foregrounding that is very, very important. And in fact, in my notes here, I have the word foreground citizen written up. So cities are about them. I think there's another dimension that we need to talk about in this idea of the missing citizen, particularly in the intersection of the conversation around smart cities, and the idea that we should talk about, I think, is digital. While the idea of a smart city is something that's evolved over time, what digital has done is that it's transformed the ability of city administrators, actually anybody in the city who's concerned about the city. So it's not just administrators and not just the state in that sense, but also for private sector participants, those who work in the city in a certain way. You could imagine an Uber or a Dunzo needing to rely on city data to understand what kind of work they need to do. And so being aware of the way digital has transformed data generation, the data gathering, the way it's transformed transmission and the utilization of data is very important when we have this conversation around the idea of a smart city. Now, what digital does is, while it sort of revolutionizes the availability of data, it also sort of tends to exclude, and like we discussed, often excludes those who are traditionally unable to access digital in the first place. Now, And there are very many ways in which this exclusion can operate. The first sort of dimension to think about is the idea of category creation. Let's take, for example, an AI system that recognizes, hotspots for traffic, let's say. And this is very much in the realm of hypothetical, and I'm going to set aside for a moment, though one perhaps should not, these questions of surveillance. But let's imagine something that can do this, identify where there is traffic, because if you're sort of running a delivery service in the city, you might want to do that. As a government that is looking to make goods and services available, governance available to different parts of the city, you might want to pay attention to that. However, in recognizing elements of a city, there's a huge amount of subjectivity that comes in from the nature of the city, the economic activity in the city, the kind of people that live in the city, the part of the country it's in. And the moment you create categories which are done or set away or in a non-participatory way that does not account for local variation and context, what you're doing is excluding differences. And just to give you an example, and this is from a slightly different domain, data labelers, for example, label various images, right? And a lot of the criticism around it has been that these are biased labels. But if you don't see a cow or a dog on the street outside in a foreign country, and you set those categories and have labelers work in different parts of the world, how will you recognize them? So this category creation in itself is political, and it's very much embedded in discourses of power. So one must pay attention to that. And that's what links up to this idea of the intersection of digital, smart city, and the way in which data is generated. The second, of course, is this idea of the reliance on digital, right? And very much, at least some aspects of this conversation have to do with this idea of individuals creating data, like the idea of data trails. You generate a range of information that can be used, but paying attention to sort of marginalization and differences in data endowment, that is also critical. Now, just as we speak about inclusion, I think there's sort of the mirror dimension of it, which is, just as we speak about exclusion, there's a mirror dimension of it, which is inclusion. And it's a little bit of a paradox, I would imagine, partly because very many communities who live in the city in the fringes definitely don't want to be visible to the state. And so being cognizant of what you want to include and why these sort of politics of inclusion and exclusion might, sort of operate to prevent people or inhibit them from participating in this data generation process, that again is something to pay attention to. I realize I'm quickly running out of time, but I think another sort of dimension that we need to talk about, and hope to circle back to it as well in this discussion itself, is that the decision-making process offline is not fundamentally set up to be inclusive or participatory or conversational. And of course, there's variation. I mean, that's not to say that it's a universal truth across India. There are variations. There are examples where, this has been done better versus worse. But to the extent that we imagine smart cities, it shouldn't just be imagined as smart. It must also therefore be imagined as just. So paying attention to all of these dimensions of exclusion, lack of participation is very, very critical in the idea of, thinking about data in a smart city. I'll pause here and over to you, Gautham.
Thank you, Sarayu. Srini, now I want to come to you. So, Amia, could you put up Srini's bio? I think what will not get captured here is the fact that this, after having had this diverse expertise across multiple parts of the world and actually being involved in the nuts and bolts of making cities work, Srini has actually now started a small startup called Urban Exchange with the intent of bringing a lot of his passion and a lot of his direction into the sector. So Srini, could you tell us a little bit about Urban Exchange? And then the question that I have to you is, given your kind of perspective of being in the trenches, that nuts and bolts way of making the city work and putting the systems, putting the machinery together to help the functioning happen, what are the challenges that tend to come up? What makes a city work? What are the challenges? When does it flounder? And what makes a smart city smart anyway? And to Sarayu's last point about the responsibility of data use, I'd like you to comment on that in terms of the capacity and the maturity of our cities to manage that data in a responsible fashion.
Thanks, Gautam, and thank you for having me here. Just very quickly, urban exchange is an absolutely newborn baby right now, but its hope and aspiration is to get into not just transforming urban thought, but into urban action. It intends to get more into action and not limit itself to thinking and ideating about how we can do better in cities. It basically is going to intends to leverage the power of digital technologies, create platform solutions for bottom of pyramid segment in our cities, and try and find new ways to create scale economies for a disaggregated informal economy. But more I'll come to the question and which looking at what this also is a manifestation of the fact that what data and digitization, what kind of opportunity it is throwing up for us in cities. And in that sense, India's journey in the smart city trajectory, which began about 6-7 years ago, I think has been quite a remarkable one. It's with all its set of chaos that's typical to the way things happen in India, but it's also throwing up some very interesting ideas and frameworks. So first is, I would say that 7 to 8 years ago, if you had engaged with a city manager and asked the city manager, do you want to meet somebody who is into data analytics, who is into databases, who is into digital technologies, and all, you would have said, I have nothing to do with all of that. I'm busy trying to solve some crisis or put some infrastructure up in my city. But I think today the scene is completely changed. I think the realization and the value of data has at least percolated into the leadership across most of our large cities. I would say the top 100, 200 cities. But this is to go further deeper down. This has to percolate down to everybody in the organization, where the mission and the government initiatives have, of course, driven them to put up digital systems, put up IoT systems, put up command centers, push for e-governance implementation, all of that. But that push has got to now start transforming into a pull, where every municipal official, where every resident welfare association, where every stakeholder in that sense in the urban sector realizes the power of actually discussing, engaging, acting based on data that lies in a context, based on data that lies for a purpose, and that becoming the basis for which we engage with. Now, so far we've all been engaging with on the basis of our needs, our wants, our history, legacy understanding of institutions and of issues, and so on. But we need to really put that in a context of hard facts and data. In fact, I am reminded of a very famous quote by Narayan Murthy, who said that in God we trust, for everybody else please bring data. So it's only when we are managing cities, that's got to be our frame. It's got to be with information. Now in this journey, I think while cities understand this and kind of stumble and move forward and their way through this, we've got to also, there are also very great, very interesting initiatives that are there from the national level, right from the framework that's been put out for measuring GDP of cities, Pritika alluded to, which is very critical. Of course, it has to mature, it has to be experimented with, but also the frameworks that have been put out for measuring ease of living, sustainability, municipal performance, governance, all of these have got to be mainstreamed. Right now, working with the ministry on how do you really institutionalize this? How do you really take this into and make this central to the way the relationship between center, state, and cities is defined and managed, and fiscal transfers are done, and so on and so forth. So there's a long way that we need to go, but I think it's a good beginning, both in terms of the action at the city level and also in terms of how governance between layers of government are beginning to see that what they need to do. Just in terms of getting this into the ground, we need to have cities where every engineer, every person who's in any level of role actually starts. It's a culture of data. It's a culture of data-driven governance, data-driven management that we need to bring in. I'll give you an example. We are at the onset of monsoon. We're going to see a lot of flooding in many of our cities. We can all be ready for that. And typically, how do cities manage? You would have started seeing, even in the midst of this pandemic, if you had observed tenders in the newspapers, you would have seen desilting tenders having come out in all this, in the midst of the peak of COVID also. That's basically because cities get into this in the last, in the month of May and early June, they get into this giving out quick contracts to get some typical hotspots in the city desilted. Now, if the cities were to be a lot more, I would say, scientific in the way they go about this, they can actually reduce this expenditure and probably even avoid it altogether. If they have better spatial data, if they have better topographical data, if they have better density data, if they have better traffic data, if they have better rainfall and weather pattern data, if they combine all of this together, they can actually significantly avoid this happening in the first place. So what they have to do, they have to ensure that in those hotspots where typical flooding occurs, those are the low-lying areas, especially if there are traffic intersections, it's going to magnify the problem, number one. If in those areas, we have to ensure that our drains are covered, solid waste doesn't enter it and choke the drains, and so on. So there are very simple ways by which, but it requires putting together a set of data and start making decisions based on that. So that's the level cities need to get into, and that's got to be operationalized. That's got to be done at not just one city, in a citywide scale, and not just in one city, but cities across the country. So we have a long journey to go, but I think if I look at the urban transformation over the last 20-30 years, this has been one major segment, or rather one major positive diversion or a positive ingredient that's been put into the mix of solutions for cities. And a lot of competencies, I hope, start coming from data and digital into the way cities are managed. That's and get embedded themselves deep within the city itself. Just like architecture, civil engineering, all of these are competencies that got embedded into city administration. Digital technologies and data management has to get embedded. There are many other disciplines also that needs to get embedded, communication and social skills and so on and so forth. So managing cities really requires a mix, but this is a very important ingredient which has just about come in, but it has to take deep roots and it has to really percolate further down.
Great. So Srini, I would also like you to take another 2 minutes and quickly speak about something you mentioned in one of our discussions, the challenges of how we traditionally look at asset creation and how everybody has to build something or buy something rather than operations, maintenance, and thinking about institutional continuity across the city. So,
this is an interesting point, because I was talking to just somebody a few days back that we had the constitutional amendment in 92, and subsequent to that for about 10 years or rather 15 years, there was a lot of dialogue and debate in the urban sector was focused on decentralization, fiscal devolution, independence, powers to the elected body, and so on. Since 2005, since JNURM, when large capex is being supported by centrally sponsored schemes, that has gone up manifold, and capex has become kind of taken over the dialogue on urban issues. So it's a lot about what projects, how it's decided, how it's procured, what kind of projects are we doing, where are we doing the capital investment, is it efficient, is it creating the outcomes, and so on. So we have really swung from a dialogue that was kind of focused on one set of issues to a different set of issues. But somewhere in this, I think one area that we really have to get into, because if you compare the dialogue with what is there around in developed world, the dialogue about smart cities, about data, is a lot about operational efficiencies. It's not about capex. It's there about fine-tuning it, optimizing your network capacities. It's about avoiding capex, in fact, and it's about being able to better service citizens. It's able to better responsiveness of our services, and so on. So I think this capex cycle will continue, but as the whole urban ecosystem has to also bring into this mix the whole operational efficiency, asset management related focus, and that's something which is very, very critical, and right now it's completely missing. And it's all about data. Like today you have projects that are completed, equipment that's installed, drawings that are done, but after that none of it goes into an asset management system, which if it did flow into, it's very natural. All the data exists, all the data is being created. But if it does flow into an asset management system, the the efficacy of operations, the life of the assets, the usefulness of those assets would be much, much more.
Great. Thank you, Shrinivas, and thank you to the whole panel for the first round of remarks. Before we move on to the next round of remarks, I want to give a quick reminder to the audience. Please keep entering your questions in the Q&A tab. After this round of comments, we will be coming to your questions. Now, to this panel, I want to actually ask you all to take a moment, take a step back and reflect on the current circumstances. We've all seen the massive impact of COVID, right? And we have seen migrants marching back, and we've seen the diversity of responses based on the size of the city, the kind of maturity of the city. And this goes to something that we spoke about a little earlier also. There's Jagan, you mentioned the fact that there was a set of metropolitan cities, and then there's a huge long tail of small towns, almost 4,000 of them, while there are 500 cities where almost 2/3 of the urban population lies. And in this context, as a country that's kind of got this interesting diversity of cities, when we need to think about the digital divide, a lot of the small tail is actually, long tail of small cities are actually on the other side of the digital divide. And so while a Bombay, a Bangalore might have the ICCCs and massive staffing, the smaller cities might actually have a 4-room office and a fewer staff to serve a population, maybe 5 to 7 people, 10 people if you're lucky, to serve 15,000 people. So I want you all to take a step back, think about the future, and think about what is the promise of the post-COVID city going to be, and how do we get there? And I'm going to start this by starting with where it hurt the most, the migrants. Sarayu, to you, how do we think about people in our cities post-COVID?
Right. Again, it's a difficult answer, but I think a few sort of principles are important to think about here. One for sure is the idea, I think Shrinivas alluded to it, but decentralized, devolve, get communities involved in every aspect, whether it's data generation in the short and medium term, or problem solving, particularly in terms of building and delivering short-term responses. So I feel like thinking about cities as communities, whether they're horizontal, geographically delimited, sometimes that the boundary becomes relevant to think about. But thinking about these networks, these sort of groups of individuals that make the city is very, very important. I think the second is, and to that extent, the idea of migration as well, being aware that a lot of, just to step back. So there's the idea of community. I think the other sort of dimension that policymakers or the post-COVID city must pay attention to is the work of a range of organizations that work with communities already. I think that in our conversation very much around governance, we often miss out this layer of, you can call them civil society organizations, but sometimes stepping into the classic theoretical frame, they really are not. They're probably more in the realm of, political society. But being attentive to these and sort of either incorporating, working with them, of course, being attentive to what some of the harms might be is also relevant. But working with local leadership, local community leadership, often political, is very, very important in the idea of a smart city. And I think we forget that. We forget in this technocratic vision, we think there are these structures that are all available that we can then immediately leverage, but they're not, and they vary across cities. So being able to find different ways to work is the second aspect. I think the third, and a little bit of a tangent here, is that data generation in the smart city is not just an imagination that includes the citizen and the state. Markets and market actors are also huge bearers and users of data. And I think either thinking about bringing them into the conversation and or regulating the availability of data is something that we need to talk a little bit more about. I don't know if this is the conversation where we sort of delve deeper into the parameters of this, But paying attention to what that means for our cities, I think is also very, very relevant in the post-COVID city. The last thought, because you started with migrants, I think, a lot of migrant labor is critical to the functioning of cities, and it's not them serving us or whatever, but the idea that migrant labor has been fundamental. It's been public infrastructure in the time of this crisis. This conversation is extremely important, it's extremely timely, and we need to foreground citizens in thinking about this. So back to you, Gautham. I hope that answered your question, but back to you.
I think it's useful. It's a direction to go in. And Pritika, I'm going to ask you to build on that. So we have to build cities for people, and we have to generate the economic opportunities to sustain these cities and grow them into their potential. What are the decisions and what are the kind of directions we should be thinking as across the scale of cities that we have?
Right. Again, everybody should jump in as well.
I was pitching that to Pritika.
Oh, sorry. Thankfully.
No, I was actually going to build on the point that you made the first time around on just like informality and how it's just, we've got these huge gaps in what we know about our cities. And I think, the migrant crisis was just this horrific exposition of what we claim doesn't exist. Like, we just forget that this entire, it's, again, we don't realize, it's easy for us to say, cities aren't growth engines and aren't economic centers. Just look at the number of people that have left their homes and moved to cities and who we are not providing for in any way, right? And the reason that they left is because their access to housing, their access to medical care, all of that is really tenuous. And I think we really have to do a lot of thinking about, if we're a country that is on the move and we are migrating for opportunity, what are we creating in our cities when people move? What are the social security systems? What's the housing? What's the transport? What helps you get your foothold in the city? And right now, all of this is provided by the informal sector. But that's something we need to address. But I'm digressing. To answer your question, or I hope to answer your question, I think, so there's no question post-COVID that we have to double down on our cities, right? I think COVID has given us this glib excuse to say that density is the problem. Density isn't the problem. It's how we manage density that's a problem. And there's a fine line between density of people, so how many people there are in a certain space, and density of built space, right? And how much space you allow for that to be built. And the two are actually very different things. So if you look at the serological surveys that we did in Bombay, for instance, you saw in the first wave that the spread was actually a lot more in slums than in non-slums, because they were able to protect themselves, right? Because, those who live in non-slums are able to protect themselves. Those who live in slums, who share a bathroom or confined to small spaces, can't protect themselves. COVID is one transmissible disease. We live in a country where we have tons and tons of transmissible diseases, right? So whether it's TB, whatever it is, you really can't protect yourself. And so I think, if anything else, we have to double down on the sorts of cities that we create, but we're also in a situation in which we're going to have to provide growth and job creation at scale, and that means that we have to focus on cities. To your point about the long tail of small cities, that's actually where we need to intervene and where we can have the most impact. Right, a lot of the infrastructure there hasn't been built, whether it's transport, housing, roads, whatever it is. And so there is room to intervene there. But the second thing, especially when you're saying that there's a digital divide between the bigger cities and the small, the thing that really needs to be built is capacity. Because we have this conversation about decentralization. We've been having it for a long time, but the truth is, if we do radically decentralize, tomorrow, things are actually going to get really bad before they get better, because we don't have the capacity, whether it's to deal with data or whether it's to make certain non-smart city decisions about it. We just don't have the capacity. So I think, really focusing on capacity building is going to be the key, and the sort of capacity building that you need across the spectrum, right? From the stuff that a smart city needs, but also the stuff that a dumber city needs, right? Water, sanitation, things like that. So yeah, I'd say we do need to double down, and capacity building is the need of the hour. It's interesting, Gautham, you were part of this as well. But when we did the data smart cities and we were looking at cities' progress, what struck me is, Surat stood ahead of the pack. Now, Surat is not a small city by any means, but what's interesting is because Surat had the plague in the 90s, they actually, and this is, before all of this was digital, what they said is we need data systems, right? We need to know who's falling sick. We need to know where they're falling sick, blah, blah, blah. So it was a pen and paper system probably. But you see 20 years later, the value of that capacity, and capacity can't be built overnight. And so I think starting now will serve us well in the future.
Great. I'm just going to editorialize here a little bit, and I'm going to say one of the beautiful things about what we saw in Surat was just the fact that it was so decision-driven in terms of how the systems got built and management-driven, as opposed to here's software and let's put it in place. So I think achieving that dream might be something we can all think about how various cities can get to. Srini, I want to come to you on this next. So if we have to achieve these kind of dreams, what are the opportunities that code has kind of opened up for us in terms of how we re-architect how the city functions, and what are the three top kind of areas of intervention when we have to kind of intervene and say, let's think differently about how cities work?
Thanks, Gautham. So I have 4 points to make here. So first, let me come to the long tail of small cities and the digital divide. I think as much as it's a challenge, there's an opportunity here as well. I think we really got to leverage the JAM Trinity, Jandan Aadhaar mobile, a lot more. And that's something that has penetrated through the walls of this urban-rural divide and so on. So we really got to find how we are going to use that a lot more to be able to reach out to people and so on. Coupled with other opportunities that come through how technologies are emerging, like cloud. Capacity building is a problem, but we've got to see how we leverage that, in the sense we don't need our small cities to understand how to maintain servers, how to maintain software, how to run eGov, nothing. As long as they know they're literate and they are just computer literate in terms of using a browser and a mouse through cloud-based solutions, we can straight away take a whole range of technology enablers straight into our small cities, tier 2, tier 3 at least. Straight away, without having to grow necessarily linear. And you might find many tier 2, tier 3 cities very fleet-footed in terms of adoption and actually making good use of it as well. So that's one. The second is, I agree with Pritika, issue is not about migrants. Who is a migrant? All of us, you, me, all of us are migrants. The issue is about informal sector. The issue is that we have a very large part of our economy and very large section of our livelihoods coming from sectors which are unorganized, which do not have digital transactions, which have no traceability, which have no way of trying to link themselves each other up into a larger value chain. And that's the problem. We essentially are a country of large number of small players. Any sector you take, this homism is true. Unlike a developed world, which is a small number of large players. And I don't think if we import solutions, if we look towards the West, we are going to solve that, because wherever we start getting a small number of large players, we are actually going to create more problems that we leave behind than we solve. So we've got to find solutions that essentially continue to have large number of small players, but we work like we are, we have the economies of scale. In fact, Urban Exchange is really inspired from that particular philosophy and is actually going to attempt to look at some solutions in that space. So it's more about how our cities learn to manage and learn to support and facilitate the informal sector, which is going to be, help us or hold us in better stead if at all we have a pandemic in the future. Which some doomsday or some whatever, some many predictions are floating around saying that let's be ready for it. It's not that it's going to, completely, this is the last pandemic that we're going to see in our lifetime. The third point I'll come to is in terms of healthcare. Many cities, many city managers didn't even run a dispensary. They're now running field hospitals. They've gone through a phenomenal learning curve in terms of what it takes to actually put a probably a tertiary health system, not really a preventive health system, not a primary healthcare system, but at least, from zero, they've gone to this in matter of few weeks and months. Let's not waste this. What it brings us emphasis is local government have a big role to play in healthcare and so in social services. Barring a few states, most cities don't even run dispensaries, don't even run schools. Education and healthcare has never been part of the local government mandate. Even by law, it is not there in many states. I think it's for us to recognize that it's high time we change that. The first mile of delivery or the last mile of delivery, whichever we look at it, has got to be local government, and education and healthcare, which clearly for the kind of development needs they have in our cities, have to be handed over to municipal bodies. They have to be equipped, financed, empowered, resourced well to be able to deal this. And they have shown that despite having no mandate towards the same, despite having no legacy, this towards the same. Ultimately, if you look at cities and all these stories that are coming out of this city model and that city model, it's all been the municipal engineers and the municipal commissioners that they have run around. Now they're getting into large vaccine campaigns. They are going to be at the forefront of these vaccine campaigns. Who's doing the allocation of vaccines now? It's the municipal bodies who are doing it, right? So I think this is bringing a very larger structural issue to the fore, and it will be wasted opportunity if we just let this pass and not deal with the structural issue. The last is even a bigger, larger structural issue. I'll end on that note. This is actually bringing back into focus the role and importance of our local government. And it's high time we had a constitutional amendment to the 74th Constitutional Amendment. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Srini. And with that, Jagan, I'm coming to you. And I see you both as a designer and an architect and also a philosopher. So please bring in both of these to help us think of the future city. And specifically, I would also like you, at the end of your remarks, to talk about how can we collaborate across multiple sectors and multiple stakeholders to make these visions come alive. Because like Srini mentioned, we need a model of multiple small players being able to collaborate with economies of scale. How do we realize that?
Thanks, Gautam. I think there are some fundamental issues that you have to settle before you can collaborate. You have to collaborate on a level playing field. So the point that Sarayu was making about inclusion, right? I think these are basics. These are fundamentals that we must have in place. Collaboration tends to be is captured by some vested interests. It tends to be because of division. So overcoming division is fundamental, Gautam. So we've got some basics still to take care of. I just want to draw our attention, to a few things, and thanks for mentioning the word philosopher again, but not that I am, but I'd like to sort of talk about the imagination of cities. I think number one, we have to stop talking about the Indian city as if it is a current reality that is a continuity of a past. The post-COVID Indian city is a completely transformed thing. We have to imagine it differently. It's an opportunity if you look at it that way. But unless we imagine it differently, we will not be able to make any progress on any of the things, for instance, that Srini has suggested, which are really wonderful sort of practical things that we can work on. I think we need to recall the outcome orientation. It's an interesting thing that, it is actually the government that came in 2014 that fundamentally emphasized that we need to keep our eyes on the outcomes. We haven't actually kept that ball afloat. We've lost that connect because partly what Srini said, we've started spending lots of money. Basically, CapEx is like our primary concern. Why is that? Because actually it's a fiscal measure, right? So you're trying to actually keep the economy going with this, I think, misfounded idea that it's called going to sort of trickle down. You spend lots of money on infrastructure and buildings, and somehow the entire economy is going to start floating again. I think there is enough research that is beginning to question that. But let's keep that outcome orientation. And the outcome for us that we have to look at is that we need to unlock ourselves. We need to decouple ourselves from a certain style of development. And we need to repurpose the city. Take the real estate market as just one simple and vivid example. If nobody is writing it, it's probably because we don't want to accept the elephant in the room. The bottom has clearly fallen out from the real estate market. If there is anything that is happening, it's because that top 0.01% of the wealth, of the wealthy are actually still throwing some cash around. How do you repurpose the city, which is not driven by real estate and space consumption and conspicuous consumption of it? How do you undivide the city, right? How do you create data as a public good? Because this is a fundamental thing we shouldn't lose sight of. However much your foundation or Sarayu's NGO or Pritika's institute or Shrinivas as a champion or a thought leader, however much we champion the idea of data-led decision-making, it's not going to happen until the government decides this is a public good that they have to make sure is available. Because what is fundamentally disruptive of good decision-making is dissonance in data. So currently, we still have different departments using different data sets. We still have decision-making based on very different data sets across the same government departments. So, getting some unity in that would help. It is ironic that we haven't run a census yet this year, but, that was, much as it was flawed, it was at least providing some basis, that everybody could refer to. But we're losing that sight of a basic public good, which is data. And I'll just share just two other thoughts here. One is that there is a metropolitan imagination about cities in India. Srini knows this, at the time of JNURM, there was this whole criticism of JNURM that it was bringing in a big city bias. That big city bias still exists. It exists in the entire political economy. It exists in our imagination of what cities are. So again, what Srini said about the smaller towns, the small and medium towns, we have to think about invigorating an imagination of those towns which is not distorted by the metropolitan imagination. So, and here I'm going to bring in two favorite references from Americana. There's a very famous play written by Thornton Wilder. It's called Our Town. If you like music, Bruce Springsteen talked about My Hometown. It's a fantastic song. But the American culture has fundamentally imbibed this. There's a reason why it actually brings about economic goods. That there is no shame in recognizing that you are in a small town, but there is a lot of pride in recognizing that your town, your hometown, is actually something that can have a trajectory all of its own, which is not dictated by Mumbai or Calcutta or Chennai or any of these, Bangalore for that matter. And I think a lot of smaller urban settlements in Karnataka will totally connect with this. It's not all about becoming Bangalore, right? So how do we do this? We need to point out what are the outcomes that come from a metropolitan imagination. They're not always good, and that you need to build from the ground up and build that vibrancy back into our cities when we repurpose them after COVID. I'll pause there. Thanks, Gautham.
I want to come back to you on this, Jagan. So you talked about data as a public good and as a shared source of truth, right? And I think it goes back to this element of trust. How do we build data as a public good in a way that we all can trust it so that it is truly a shared source of truth?
I mean, I don't know what to say. Maybe this sounds completely banal, but how do you do it? By doing it. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I think the COVID situation, and a lot of us have, I completely lost it when I saw what was happening with data on COVID, and continues to happen. That's simply untenable. No government worth its name should actually preside over, and I don't mean just the central government, I mean all governments in our country, whether they're city or state or center, can preside over this level of chaos doesn't describe it. This level of complete, disarray in terms of data, that simply is untenable. So you've got to do it. You have to build those platforms that bring that data together, check for dissonance, and make sure that that becomes the base of decision making across the ecosystem, not just by a single player. And I think Sarayu mentioned, the role of the private sector, is very important here. It can't be that they're trying to monetize data at the cost of public good. You know what I'm saying? I mean, monetization needs to be built into the idea of building public goods. So I think that this is a whole new debate or a bigger debate. But I would say, let's get down to doing it.
Great, thank you. So with that, I'd like to come back to the questions. There's 3 questions, so you can all, as panelists, see them in the chat, but I'll read out the first one. This is from Manish. Can you give examples of cities that are leveraging data well? What have they done right? And on this, I'd like to go Srini, Pritika, Sarayu, Jagan.
So let me try and answer this with, in India, the cities are still going up the learning curve. So I think it's too early for me to say who's doing well. I don't have the ministry has come out with a comprehensive framework called the Data Maturity Assessment Framework. It's interesting. It will improve over time, but it's at least a start as to really seeing how data mature they are. The framework needs to gradually evolve to not just looking at prevalence of systems, but also usage, adoption, and effectiveness, and all of that. So, but that's a good framework. But I just wanted to give some examples. Many cities I have worked with or I have studied, they've done very interesting ways in the way they look at data. I'll just mention a couple of them to close my answer. Some of them have very interestingly looked at data to actually look at how they will manage their capital investment or optimize their capital investment with as against a limited budget. There's a famous city, Cambridge, in Ontario, Canada, that actually came up with a very simple mathematical model to do so, where they looked at all the asset life cycles and the maintenance requirement, and against a limited budget, they came up with what is the level of maintenance we need to do so as to optimize the overall life of the asset, as compared to a classic engineering solution would have been to do a condition assessment and then come up with a design and then come up with a cost, and so on. So cities have used data very innovatively. I think many cities, Indian cities, will slowly go down that path.
Thank you. Sarayu?
Oops. I think there's, I think others have made this point before. I think paying attention to what aspect of data use and management the city has done better is useful to be aware of. One example, that's worth thinking about, of course, is the use of data by Estonia in their e-governance work in Tallinn, and more broadly the availability of digital services. I think what it also, of course, the context is very different. So being aware of that is as important as looking at what best practices emerge from each context. I think also what underlies or what backs the digital infrastructure in the case of Estonia is also solid and robust data management practices. And I don't think we can get away from that discussion, particularly in the era of greater digitization. Because as you digitize services, there's a huge degree of atomization and there are data trails generated at the individual level. So being attentive not just to the ways in which data has been utilized in the city, but also data has been safeguarded, civil liberties are protected is equally important. Back to you, Gautham.
Thank you. Pritika?
So, I was trying to think of cities that I've seen that have done it well. The two that come to mind, and I, don't know this as well as Srini, is, so one, like I said, I was extremely impressed with Surat. And I think the thing that really stuck out is they knew why they were collecting what they were collecting, and they knew exactly what they were going to do with the data. And so that sort of iterative process of, okay, so this is what we need to add, this is what we don't care about, I think shows a certain level of maturity that all cities should get to. The second is, and this is, across the state and in the cities as well, it's just what Kerala has been able to do with their data for the pandemic, right? And I know that's one of the next questions. What they've been able to do really well is pull together data from different sources to really create, you're able to track things, you're able to see how the data interacts with one another, and it's truly phenomenal what they've done. So those would be my 2 things.
Thank you. And Jagan, when you're answering, I'd also love to hear from you about a topic you've spoken about a lot, simulating the city using data as well. And how can we do that better?
Sorry, did you say simulating?
Yeah. So one of the topics we've always spoken about is how do you simulate the city?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the city of Wellington in New Zealand has used a digital twin of the city to take care of their COVID challenges. I think we have to move in the direction of three-dimensional visualization of the city, because fundamentally there is a barrier to decision making in cities, which is the spatial barrier. Not knowing where your problem is located, like Pritika mentioned earlier, not knowing it is a big problem, because you can't possibly take decisions where you don't know the exact spatial context or the physical context of the outcome of your decision. So I think simulating the world for the decision maker is fundamental. But Gautham, we've also had some years ago, we've had discussions about a new approach to City Hall. I mean, well, sorry to use an American term, but a municipal, discussion space where the entire city and its data model is actually in front of you, so that you're not, the public and the decision makers aren't working at cross purposes or disagreeing about data. The data is like a transparent model in front of you. And so you can talk about substantive issues. I think there's lots that technology and data science is able to do for us. We suspect it because it's not there. It's a bit like if somebody had told you that, the internet, I mean, I actually used the internet before Windows. In fact, I was a student in the US when Windows started. And, if you think of that world before Windows, it just seems to be, and people would have suspected Windows at that time as well. It's a bit like that. I think we have a suspicion of this as smart technology that's not affordable, that is, not amenable. And yet, the day that it becomes a reality for us, when the technology development catches up, like it is in cities like Wellington, we'll treat it as, as a commonplace solution.
Thank you, Jagan. And Aniket has an interesting question around the digital illiterate, and I'm going to expand that a bit also to talk about potentially those citizens who are actually illiterate and are able to participate in smart cities. How can we reach them? How can we, instead of excluding them, actually proactively include them? And Sarayu, I'd like you to come in on this, and then Pritika, I'd like you to build on that.
Right. I think this is something we've talked about quite often, Gautham, publicly in the work that we do, as well as more broadly. I think that to assume, the atomized assumption that operates particularly with many digital technologies is something we need to start moving away from. And we need to start seeing members of the city as communities, as members of groups, as members of communities, as sort of different solidarities that exist amongst each other. And what that means, therefore, is that you think very hard about who intermediates and who brings data to the table. So working with, and this is something we talked about a little earlier as well, but who intermediates and brings data to this table? Can it be civil society organizations? Can it be some of these offline architectures, is perhaps too technical, but what you could see as individuals, organizations, community leaders that exist offline, that mediate and bridge communities and bring them online, is really what we need to get very, very serious about. Very many of these exist. I think that but finding the terms of engagement, finding incentives, and very wary of that term because it comes with a lot of connotations, but finding how do you engage with these groups, how do you engage with these individuals without creating more harm or entrenching some of the harmful practices that are present is really what we need to talk about. So back to you.
Pritika, please.
Sure. And, I mean, I think we've seen a stark example of what the digital divide means, with the rollout of the vaccines, for instance, right? I mean, CoWIN is hard for, it's a fantastic system. It's hard for all of us to access. There's obviously, broader issues, but it's virtually, you realize it's virtually impossible for a very large section of the population to navigate it. Right? And I think these are very, very real issues that the digital illiteracy, huge issues that we have to confront. And I think and I thought of this while Sarayu was speaking, which is, in this push for digital data, we shouldn't forget that fundamentally what we want is data, right? So we want data. If the person enters it in a digital format, or we digitize it, or it ends up, that's great. But that's the second thing. What we essentially want is data. We want, data that's clean and reliable and comparable. But it's the data and then the digital that matters.
Thank you. Jagan, you also wanted to jump in on this.
Yeah, Gautham, just very quickly, I wanted to mention 2 points. One is that one of the causes of exclusion tends to be language. It's a linguistic problem. But today, at a time, and frankly, I don't have an accurate count of how many Indian languages are available, fonts, and in real time, these translations of content are possible. You can use Wikipedia and you'll see what kind of language translations are available. It's phenomenal. So one barrier is beginning to fall away, right? The other barrier, which is access to the net itself, right? Which is currently sort of, somewhat mediated by companies that give you data plans, but basically just fill your data plan with all kinds of rubbish that you end up using, whether it's games or news that you don't really need. I think the idea is, I heard about a city in North America that actually wants to provide hubs, which are mobile hubs, where you can actually access it. In San Francisco, the public library does it on a regular basis, I think on a weekly basis, provides a space where you can access technology for free, right? Another city is thinking of literally a mobile thing, like a mobile library, and every single block in the poorest parts of town, at least the school children must be able to access, learning material, which is now available digitally by having internet access, right? Frankly speaking, this is a political economy issue. I used to say in my first sort of evangelizing in 2014, of the smart city, I used to say this in public, that I don't understand why we can't actually put investment into that 3,000 rupee, smartphone that every single citizen in this country actually is given as a right. You know what I'm saying? I think these are problems that we need to collectively debate and really work on. For a country our size, these are not insurmountable. It is because our political economy is so oriented towards elitism that we simply don't get around to addressing these solutions.
Yeah, I'd like to, if you permit, Gautham.
Sarayu and then Srini.
Thank you.
Fastest figure first.
Yeah, no, I just like to jump in and build on something Jagan mentioned. The idea of languages as being exclusionary, absolutely agree. Part of the challenge around access to the last mile is devices, but there's also a big challenge around navigating what seems frightening and complex. Just on that note, we're doing a little survey, a combined sort of, ethnographic plus survey on access to CoWIN, and we sent out a survey on WhatsApp groups, and very often, it reaches only elite individuals. And one of the things that we've noticed is that we have very few respondents who are 60 plus. And the ones that are 60 plus, if you sort of break down the data, all say we had to get our children to fill up this form as well. What are you talking about, COVID? So the idea that, that somehow just access solves it is not enough. I think that, getting into the next layer of what does access breakdown mean. The other dimension, and I think Jagan alluded to it, is this idea of marginality is very much changing. The elderly experience significant difficulties. Disability with respect to technology is often invisible. So being able to map, understand, and then think of, what does it mean to generate data, like Pritika said, versus the digital is, I think, very, very significant. Over to back to Gautham.
So I have to share this anecdote with you all since we're talking about COVID. Sarayu spoke about need for intermediation and so on. So today morning, I was talking to our house helper. She has a smartphone, and we were trying. She was asymptomatic positive. Fortunately, she didn't fall ill. She was okay, and she wanting to come back and start. So I was trying to explain to her, which mentioned about vaccination, and we were trying to explain to her that vaccination is something you give to prevent a disease. Even if she is cured, she did not become unwell, and she is still perfectly healthy and fine, she still needs the vaccination. So, she has a smartphone. She had no idea of COVID. She didn't know she had to get that vaccination, injection that she has been hearing about in her basti, and all that. So the point is, what Sarayu said is very valid. We need to find innovative ways to disintermediate this. We need to find ways by which some of the excluded, even with access, are going to have challenges. I'm sure if, cities commissioners are given targets and they're said, they've got to finish vaccination universally within a certain months, they will innovate, they will come up with vans, they will come up with ways they can set up these counters in these places and do it. So we've got to have that goal orientation. But what I'm more concerned about is how do we really change this for a long term? Once one municipal commissioner has told me, don't worry, anything that's got to be done in a campaign mode, we will do it with all sincerity, and we'll do it to its fullest, because we're very good when anything has to be done in a campaign mode. But if you ask about efficiency, if you ask about things that have to be done for posterity, that's where we fail. So I think this context of data systems, digital, all of that, we also got to look at what really transforms fundamentally. And, we spoke about migrants, are we really going to, we spoke about livelihoods and economy. Are we going to change some of these fundamental underlying structural faults that we have in our society so that it will actually change for the long run and not just, for quickly getting over a pandemic?
Perfect. Jagan, 30 seconds. You mentioned something about the hole in the wall project. I think I remember it. And I know there's a lot of people who might not. So if you can just mention in 30 seconds what that was and what we should remember.
Well, I mean, it was an amazing experiment, and we just simply have forgotten it. We haven't even, other experimenters haven't even built on that experiment. Sugata Mitra, professor, MIT, put a computer screen inside in a slum settlement, just a hole in the wall, literally. And the experiment was about basically, do people who actually are supposedly illiterate, do they actually find it, number one, curious enough to interact with that computer, and do they begin to actually do something with it, which is sort of productive? And answer was, broadly speaking, and I'm not going to get into the details of it, answer was yes. So, it is possible for this technology to be available even without linguistic per se and based entirely on icons. There are that's what children are doing today. Toddlers are using computers on the basis of the most simple languages as interface. So I would say, maybe this can be sort of from my side, it can be a closing point, which is that, heck, when did we think that this technology has stopped? The innovation curve of digital technology is somehow over. We've only just begun, actually. So, let's keep that in mind, that there's just immense amount of innovation that still needs to go into this. But you do have to believe in the power of it.
Great. And with that, I just want to quickly kind of add one point on this. I think what blew my mind was, in the absence of formal frameworks of education and what you could or couldn't do as a slum kid, these kids actually went to the point where they were able to study topics like genetics and biodiversity, starting from just having access to the internet. So we should not underestimate the innate potential of people who are non-elite. We probably are not the best benchmark of what human potential is. With that, I'd like to quickly come to Gayatri Doctor's question from CEPT University, which is smart cities open data portal does exist, but then this is only for the smart cities, so early stages. How do we ensure open data for municipalities and towns? Are they digitally ready? So Srini and Pritika, can you speak to the capacity issues? Srini, I see you've typed a response.
Yes, I just keyed in a response. So very quickly, I think right now it's all a push factor. Cities are being mandated and so on. But over time, as they see some innovation germinating from the data they put out, they will see the value of it. But I think cities need to go up the learning curve of making use of data themselves before they see what others can create value out of. They themselves have not realized the value out of it. So it will take some time for them to put it out to see where others can make value out of it. So in that sense, open data portal for cities is a little bit futuristic, but hopefully, in India, there'll always be a few cities that will catch on to it, latch on to it, and be the pioneers, beacons who will show the way for the others.
Thank you, Pritika.
So, just to go back to a point I just made, I think what we have to do is we have to separate this idea of digital from data. Like they're not always the same. And I think the challenge, so if you're not a smart city or you are a smart city, is what is the data that you need? Are you collecting it correctly? How are you using it? If it's in digital format, and it most likely will be because that's probably the easiest way to collect and enter it, that's great. But I think we have to, when we're doing this exercise of starting cities on their data journey, we actually have to start them one level earlier than we are right now. I mean, there's tons and tons of administrative data that's collected. Digitizing it is not going to make a difference. What's going to matter is, are you revisiting what you're collecting in the first place? And smaller cities actually in a great place to start that journey.
Great. Thank you. With this, I want to move to our closing round. This is going to be a speed round, no specific question. Yeah. I just want each of you to sum up your thoughts based on this interesting discussion. And is there anything that you wanted to say, but I didn't ask you about it, or I moved on? So please take the time for that. I would say 3 minutes each, and we'll start with Pritika.
Okay. I think the only thing I'd like to emphasize, I think we have to make this point a lot more strongly in India, that cities will be a pathway to prosperity. It's just not a narrative that has captured the political imagination or the public imagination. And data plays a really big role in building that narrative. So whether it's, how urban is India? Can we visualize that growth? Can we see what's happening when we allow that growth to happen unplanned? Can we see the detrimental impacts of unplanned growth? I think building that narrative and using data to build that narrative is an extremely important project for us in the coming years, because I think we're at that crucial point in our history where if we don't manage this transition well, we may actually miss the boat on it.
Great. Srini, can I invite you in next?
So, while we were having the discussion, I was just imagining of a day, and I'm sure it's not too far away, that, you've seen sitting in government office, in office of a lot of babus, the amount of time they take to retrieve a file, to retrieve a particular document in a file and a particular data fact they're searching for in a file, etc. And how that delays decision making in so many ways. File also goes back and forth, etc. So now, as cities are slowly, few trying to adopt e-office, which is now largely there in the central level. But I was working with a couple of cities that were struggling to adopt the e-office. So soon we should have AI tools that overlay it, and then you'll have a city commissioner just ask a question of saying orally, and he will be told file number so and so, reference number so and so. This is the text. This is what had happened then 5 years earlier, and therefore so and so, so and so. And so, rather than the bureaucrat in a hurry, either making a small noting without having the time to go through the entire file, or wasting time trying to dig that out, technology will enable. So technologies will evolve. They will become great enablers. But I think what will be required is innovation in business models and right incentives to really put them to effective use.
Thank you. Sarayu, can I invite you in for your closing remarks?
Right. Thank you so much. I have just 3 points to make. I think, to sort of build on Pritika's point, I struggle with parsing digital from data, particularly in the context of the city. I think in very many realms of urban life, I think particularly governance, a lot of service delivery at the urban level, digital is very much inherent to what we imagine as a smart city. And I think paying attention to the differences in the way these manifest is very, very important. And particularly in this aspect of, where delivery is atomized, where delivery is digital in a certain way, being attentive also to questions around data management, privacy, surveillance, regulation, all of those is very, very critical. The second, of course, is I think, there's often a tendency, and I fall into the trap very often of seeing last mile access problems as purely capacity ones. They are not. Indeed, the margins of technology are changing. Very many more people are excluded, but there's also growing cost to engaging with technology, and you might want to choose, or you might choose to, you would like to opt out of it. It's like a shoe leather cost that you don't want to take onto yourself. Very often it is puzzling. While the hole in the wall experiment is fairly significant in what it did, to realize that that doesn't necessarily translate into either offline action or being able to redress grievances. I think being attentive to the limits of digital in that sense is also very, very important in thinking about the smart city. But thank you very much, and back to you, Gautham.
Thank you. And Jagan, your last words on this?
I think, Gautham, my last point would be, and this is a unique moment after many decades, one could say more than a century, that public health is on everybody's minds. The way that we monitor our body's performance, in a sense, medicalization is at a level where we are doing micro-analysis of our body's performance. We must use that as a way to metaphorize how cities perform. So healthy cities, both physically as well as mentally good spaces for mental health, this is fundamental. And I think we need to seize the moment to make the public get more involved in city building, simply because this is as good a moment as any we'll ever get to drive home the point that at the end of the day, one of the key outcomes, which is a measurable outcome, is going to be your lifespan, your ability to do work, your productivity, and many other aspects, and your ability to reach self-fulfillment, because your mental health depends on the milieu and the way in which the city performs. This is a fantastic moment. It's the kind of moment that we had which created the town planning profession in our country. There was a committee in 1946 called the Boer Committee that actually laid down a lot of the principles that actually guide town planning in India. And they were based on an assessment of the health systems of India before independence. So, I can't say this enough, that let's really drive home the point about healthy cities. We can have debates endlessly, but let's achieve one basic consensus that for the next generations and for our own lifespans, we need healthy cities.
Thank you, Jagan. Thank you all panelists. Amir, with that, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thanks, Gautham. Thank you, everyone, also for keeping us so precisely on time in this era of Zoom fatigue. It is a matter of pride to be able to say we started on time and are ending on time as well. So thank you, everyone, for keeping it crisp and moving. Thank you to everyone who joined us for the panel. We hope you enjoyed the discussions, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going. And again, in closing, thank you to Clear and the JPAL network and all of the organizers of Eval Week for this platform and this opportunity. Have a good evening or good day, depending on where you are, and take care.
Thank you, Amir, and thank you, Gautham. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amir. Thank you, Gautham.
Wonderful
Thank
session.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing this. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.